Although psychology and pedagogy have always maintained the belief that a child is a happy being without any conflicts and have assumed that the sufferings of adults are the results of the burdens and hardships of reality, it must be asserted that just the opposite is true. What we learn about the child and the adult through psychoanalysis shows that all the sufferings of later life are for the most part repetitions of these earlier ones, and that every child in the first years of life goes through an immeasurable degree of suffering. And welcome everybody to another edition of the Unslaved Podcast. We're very happy to be here with you once again, and we're going to be discussing Michael's work on adultism, and calling the show Adultism, the Reign of the Terrible Mother. And Michael, maybe a few thoughts on that opening quote. And also I just want to, before we start, just congratulate you on your new book and continuing this work. And I'm looking forward to getting into this discussion with you today.
Thanks very much. It's actually, I noticed it's the best-selling book so far, it's less than a month out.
Wow.
And it's doing very well. And good feedback, both on the Female Illuminati Facebook group and personal emails. It's being taken very well by fans and stuff like that, which is good, because remember, this is as much a book to address issues that help to enlighten and free women as much as men. So it's not about any rant against womankind. It's a continuation of a very deep probe into female psychology, started in Dragon Mother, but this is not leftover stuff. This is, again, my old way of turning the same subject matter around, never saying that this book or that thought is definitive. Let's take it up again. Let's open the file again, look at it 3-4 times. So adultism is actually very deep. It's a shortish book, but it's extremely deep and very, very comprehensive, looking at toxic parenting in general, with a particular focus on female psychology again. But the opening quote there is a motive, because the great Melanie Klein and others in her school, right, and some related schools did notice this. Alice Miller, it's a myth. A lot of what we know about childhood is a myth. Whether there is even a thing called childhood, every era has its own framing of what childhood means. I mean, the Victorian era, the Enlightenment era, the classical era, and then this modern era, the very concept of childhood has changed. But when you come at it from looking at from the female psychology, I think because that has been completely neglected. This is, I think, stronger. So much has been written on childhood. So much has been written even on toxic parenting. In many ways, that's why my books are very concise. I don't just repeat what I know is out there in lots and lots of other books. That to me is far. Why pad the book when you've got classics out there on that subject? I'm trying to penetrate through all of that and get to some underlying truths, existential truths about male and female psychology that are not addressed. Not at all. And female psychology is something that fell off the map years ago, if it ever was famous. I never been able to find the time when it was famous and popular. And it's a tremendously neglected area, you know what I mean? But you see, the whole thing needs to be revisioned, because now, because of media or whatever you want to think of it, the reason, there's been new insights into the role of women. The UN has just reported that women are some of the main drug traffickers. There's more sex crimes done that are attributed to women, meaning it's rising. It's much larger than people ever thought. There's more infatuation from women with total thugs and serial killers. I mean, how do you explain that, right? I'm talking about the psychological underpinnings, right? There's record rates of child sexual abuse, some of it astonishingly cruel, from mothers and women. Date crimes are not just to women. Women are equally represented, or almost equally represented in that. Their false reports are, police bodies now understand that they're inundated, right, with false rape accusations, false abuse accounts, right? The whole thing with that Instagram and all of these Me Too movements, just nonsensical, unprovable cases. And then more seriously, I'd say the blame game. People now, just now in our last few years since the millennium, the blame game of women, of constantly accusing the male for every affront that happens to them, creating a victim culture and a virtue signaling culture. This is now reaching the mainstream. Right. So now female psychology, the question of, although still in a most primitive stage, has in fact bled over into pretty much mainstream culture. Nothing like where it will go. And it's in the early stage. But everything I study, has that early stages thing, and then it becomes. I'm absolutely glad that now I find a platform to do this work where it's also current. I'll be doing it anyway, but it's extra nice to see that our culture isn't really that far. And there's a certain openness now to looking again from a different, perspective, putting on those they live glasses, to look at this, because that blame game that women have been playing and that victimology behind which they've been hiding is running very, very thin now. And then the juxtaposition of their accusations. I think we talked about this before. The juxtaposition of them hating the patriarchy, which is common to all groups of feminism, all the feminist movements, and yet the stark statistical fact that women like alpha males. Well, the alpha male is the builder of the patriarchy. And then even behind that is a bigger truism of all men are born from women. So no matter who it is, Genghis Khan was born from a woman, Adolf Hitler, Napoleon, George Soros, right? Your accusations are pointing, but you bred them. Now, that has to be brought back to the fore again. These are incredible factoids that have a little bit slipped from people's thinking. But, it now beholds us all to bring back that simple fact that should have been obvious from the start. But of course, the job is made harder a little bit, not that I'm afraid of it, but the job of addressing female psychology, whether you're a woman or a man, I mean, everybody listening to this, you're going to find resistance from that feminist movement, from the extreme left feminist thugocracy that's now, draconian and Orwellian and imperious and, looking over your shoulder. But that should never be, because they've got a lot to lose should any of these facts come out. In fact, their whole premise, Dragon Mother, and that does overthrow their entire premise by just what I said. If it can be shown that women, in some sense, are creating the patriarchy that then they later disingenuously, or a group of women disingenuously, because we are actually really talking only about a very small demographic, let's admit that. But that demographic is very powerful and they got some big money behind them. And if they're accusing the patriarchy when in fact they're hiding from you the fact that female psychology has helped erect it, then we have to get into looking at the forensics of that. And that's what these books do. They look at this crime, and show how the female psyche itself, which in many cases seems to be hostile to the patriarchy, actually brings it into existence. But you just can't say that without a detailed proof of it. Because as I say, the current meme is that there's something wrong with the patriarchy, something wrong with Western solar culture, and it needs to be brought down. Now, there are a lot of things wrong with it. But as I'm showing, those things are actually fixable. And what we've got now, the current meme, is the one that's the most damaging to this whole premise.
Yeah, so that's so well said. And I was just thinking as you were talking about the idea of the victim culture, who's creating it, what's behind it, why it's so powerful, why it's so popular. And there's this question of, okay, if this sort of female thugocracy or feminist elite, or however you want to call it, are injecting this into the culture through the fact that they have access to the media and they have all the power and influence to do it, that's fine and good. But why are people buying into it? What's so appealing about the victim culture? Why does it pull at people? Yeah. Why is it so, and why are so many, what I would say, women that otherwise would probably be good women, that would be very moral. They would go down a different path if they had better influences in the culture to learn from, but that are sort of, they're nescient, they're ignorant. They don't understand, they don't think about these things. They're just repeating what their parents did to them. They're repeating what they see in the culture. They're buying into these things. But the question is how there's a powerful element to this that sucks people into it, and it turns them off course, and it pulls them into like a new cult. And it's as if people are begging for that. They want a new religion. They've taken all, religion's gone, and atheism and scientism tried to come in and replace that, but it's still not jiving because it doesn't answer all the emotional harangues and questions and existential questions people have. So then they're looking for anybody, any kind of leader, any kind of savior, any kind of new thing to jump into. So what do you think the reason is for the people that want this and that buy into it?
Well, the type that you're talking about, mostly the socialized, I just want to call it liberal because I look at myself as somewhat of a liberal. That's not a word that's going to work, but this extreme leftist, socialistic type, the communitarian type, the globalist type, they're buying this meme because secretly, and that's what the whole books are about, matrophobia, regression. Because when I say feminization, it's really a synonym for wholesale regression, both on the personal level, but on a social level. Now, apart from Gustave Le Bon, Ayn Rand, and maybe you're dealing with a handful of great scholars, who dealt with the question of social regression. And we have, because of the first 7 years of life, this is why the children think, this is why it's called adultism, because it's all based in the premise that Freud addressed, right? He didn't invent it, he's just observing it, and everybody's got their own perspectives on it, right? But the first 7 years of life are a power struggle. And the result of that power struggle will be a kind of outlook, right? And either you're going to adjust heroically to the solar world of the masculine and the patriarchal, or you're going to constantly recoil from it. Even if you're in it, even if you find some way to sort of move around in it, right? You're psychologically regressed. And so the promise that then becomes the meme is that there is some other gynocratic world which can exist, in contradistinction to that patriarchal world. And this is the flaw. But it's a very attractive kind of image in a way. Now, until we get there, we have the surrogate version of that, or the intermediary version, which is the crowd consciousness that Gustave Le Bon and other people. So it's been a lifelong study of mine. You see, to not only go through their work and understand it, but then to expand upon it. Because one of the roads to regression is crowd consciousness, which is feminine, which is malignant, right? Which is an attempt to rival the masculine power. Call it penis envy, right? If you have to, it's just a placeholder term for a regressive, feminized type to say, how do I get the power this power of the masculine is alluring. I partly want to lick it, but I partly want to destroy it.
Mm.
So in that type of mentality, which is an infantile type of consciousness, the crowd becomes largely inadequate, but it serves for the time. Because remember, it's a high that needs to keep being repeated, right? But there's a little high there, because anytime you bring a lot of people together, a connected battery, we've got a protest, we've got we've got a cause, we've got an ideal, then there is a charge, a kinetic charge. Now, it'll need to be repeated again and again and again until finally something happens, like a critical mass is reached. And remember, we all need it. So, I'm not saying that there's the outsider and there's no crowd consciousness. Going to a concert, hanging out at a barbecue, going to an event, even a classical type of event, a very high cultural event, is still elements of crowd consciousness. But it doesn't mean that somebody's erased their entire identity.
Right.
To
it's
join
extremes,
that thugocracy.
Right? It's all about extremes.
Right. That's it. Basically, that's it. But unfortunately, we have this crusading group that is looking for aberrations, and it's remember, this would not even cause us the slightest problem if we were talking about it, say, in the 1800s. But since the advent of communism, this is where the political tie-in, because we'll get to that in a minute about how these books also address the kind of leftist. I'm explaining it, right? Explaining what nobody else seems to be able to explain, no matter these Molyneux and all how great they are. They're still miles away because they haven't factored in female psychology. But since the early 20th century, people from the Frankfurt School and other orgs like that have realized that woman is a doomsday weapon to be used for their aim, which is the destruction of Western civilization. And so there's now a sort of an engine, a sinister demonic engine behind the things we're talking about, highly funded women belonging to some of the most satanic societies that you could ever imagine. And then they have their spokespeople, both men and women, trying to install this lunar, Medusan, Stygian gynocracy on steroids, with lots and lots of backing. So the books are also addressing this, right? They are not just pure psychology. They are largely psychology, but there's enormous need in them to explain, where the socialist type, which was shot down years ago. I mean, and actually there's a time when it held no power. Then it's backing, especially in American context, it held no power. And then so suddenly, now we're knee deep in these creatures, right? First they were inconspicuous. How does it come about? And one of the reasons is directly psychological. The feminized type, male or female, is somebody who basically recoils from reality. They want to live in being regressive. Regressive to what? Well, that's the pleasure principle. And so those people are normally frightened, insecure, confused, usually very complaining, rather emotionally impoverished. And with their communist veneer on top, they tend to be ones who can live with less. They can mimic a virtue by saying, I don't need a lot of material things. I'm a communist. It's all born out of this impoverished. You're not seizing reality. You're not heroically working towards having a nice house with a swimming pool and all. What's wrong with any of that? Right? But they are the impoverished ones. So as an umbrella to cover up, these impoverished types choose socialism. That's just one anecdote. I go into like greater depth how the whole...
Yeah, sorry, I'm thinking, is this like some kind of a weird fetish or what's the word I'm looking for? Like sadomasochistic or when you're saying that they're impoverished, and it's funny you say they're impoverished emotionally. I find that interesting because they often like to put out this emotional, they're always crying, Trump gets elected or something happens to spoil the party and they're out crying in the streets, and then they're always, we need to help. There's always about trying to help the downtrodden and it's like, we all want to help the people that are downtrodden. We want to help the people that are impoverished, but there's ways to help them. You don't just give them free lunches, you help empower them, and they want to look at it from a different perspective. So is that because, as you say, they're impoverished within, so they need to impoverish the rest of the culture? They can't just be satisfied with dealing with their own situation. They need to bring everybody else down with them in a weird way, right?
Yeah, because they're a deeply hypocritical type of person, right? Who's in such inner pain. That's why I had you read that intro, because they're in such a deep state of psychosomatic pain that a lot of them things branch off from that. Dissociation from it, the inevitable hypocrisy, and this. But it's all rooted in the relationship with the mother, because obviously the mother is not only the person's first caregiver, right, nurturer, but mothers. We have this, I don't know if it's a myth, but the myth is that the woman craves more intimacy than, say, a man does, right? But the thing that's never mentioned is that anyone who can enter into more intimacy with you also has more power over you, more power to destroy your will, right? If you're not intimate with somebody, think of a friendship. If you only know the associate, it's not as hard when you find out that he did something bad. If it's somebody you have a deeper tie with, it hurts like crazy, right? So what happens in that relationship with this type of mother who does play this game? Then you're going to end up despising intimacy, because you've realized on some level that by getting intimate with a person makes you much more vulnerable. And in the worst case scenario, which is what I'm dealing with in these books, then there's a cache of rage, right? The child is not only against intimacy, it's in full rage of how it's been abused. And the child then learns early on that the thing that it hates, it also loves, right? This is another dynamic brought up by, say, Karen Horney, that just as you're about to say, I want to tear and I want to rend this person, I want to scream and kick and wet my bed and all these things that children, grinding the teeth, beating up the siblings, smashing toys, all of these things that they do to illustrate that they're angry, right? Even their bad dreams and all come from this. But it's just acting out. They can't articulate it, but they articulate it physically. The trouble then is for the child, and this is by 1 year of old. Can you imagine, right? 1 year of old, 1 year, they already discover that there's a deep problem. And that is that they love and hate. Even love is probably wrong. It's just that they need. At that point, it's more like a need. Love is almost too sophisticated, right? So the need for the parent is then conflated and mixed up with this incredible hatred and rage for being denied warmth, nurture, and just having its raw needs being met. Now, how does this answer your question? Well, the point is that it moves from that state on, because now the only resolution to that schism that I talked about, the only resolution that you both love and hate, let's just use those terms for now, is to beat yourself up for the hate, which then leads to a guilt. So legitimate hatred in a child for affronts by the parent generate hatred and dissatisfaction, right? Because child doesn't know how to delay its gratification, so it just responds. Then the psychology comes in. This is the earliest stages of the superego, and comes in the guilt for having these hateful feelings. And so instead of accepting them and understanding them, or having a parent that will coach you through that understandingly, the whole thing goes pear-shaped, and then the child lives with a cache of self-hatred for identifying with a parent, for trying to love the loveless or the cruel, right? And the result, and then the next step that comes from the guilt is, and born out of the same need, right, born out of the same thing that builds the guilt, is to fall into lockstep with the will of the subconsciously hated object or parent. So this is where you meet most children before they're even 2 or 3 years old. This dynamic, what I'm describing, goes on. And it's going to be the one that is the real cement of this is how you pour it. It still hasn't become the superego yet, but this is the mix that goes in, and it's deeply hypocritical. Then, on top of that, now that the child has fallen into lockstep with the will of the parent, it becomes automatic then, because the parent teaches this to the child, to seek approval from everyone around it, the world. So now its will, because it has fallen into lockstep and isn't an outsider, it will follow this idea that the mother or the father is showing off the child, and the child has to act a certain way that ingratiates, because the superego is about getting approval, right? That's probably, in fact, in terms of normal psychology, that is the definition of the superego, that which, helps you become so accepted by your society, right? Okay, what that does then, it makes one of the biggest neurotic tendencies or traits that you find in these people who are part of the thugocracy, those ones who start crying in the streets and howling and rolling around in the mud, right? These are the neurotics who so much need to virtue signal because they're deeply needing that approval. So this is a long-winded way of getting to answer your question, right? But that neurotic is all around, not just in a political milieu. You'll find them at work. People who take affront for the slightest thing, are just incredibly compulsive and all the rest of it.